The bank statement fell from my trembling hands like a death certificate, the numbers swimming before my tear-filled eyes. 0. After 15 years of marriage, after building what I thought was our future together, after sacrificing my own dreams to support his ambitions, my life savings account showed absolutely nothing, not even a penny. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare that became my salvation, I need to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city in the comments below, and if this story hits close to home, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I'm sharing something that will change how you think about protecting yourself forever. The silence in our pristine kitchen felt deafening as I stared at that devastating bank statement. Outside our floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seattle skyline glittered with promise. But inside our million-dollar penthouse, my world was crumbling. The granite countertops that Marcus had insisted we needed, the designer appliances he'd convinced me were investments, the artwork he'd selected to impress his business partners. It all felt like a mausoleum now, beautiful and cold and lifeless. My hands shook as I refreshed my banking app over and over, desperately hoping for a glitch. A mistake? Anything that would explain how $847,000 had simply vanished. This wasn't just money. This was my inheritance from my grandmother, carefully saved over decades. This was the nest egg I'd built working 60-hour weeks as a financial analyst while Marcus pursued his entrepreneurial dreams. This was supposed to be our security, our children's college funds, our retirement. The worst part? I knew exactly where it had gone, and exactly who had taken it. 3 hours earlier, I'd come home from my business trip to Chicago expecting Marcus's usual enthusiastic welcome. Instead, I'd found our bedroom scattered with evidence of his betrayal. A red lace bra that wasn't mine draped over my pillow. A receipt for a $15,000 necklace from Tiffany with a woman's name I didn't recognize. Hotel bills for romantic getaways I'd never taken, but even those discoveries paled compared to what I'd found when I checked our financial accounts. My personal savings, cleaned out. The joint checking account we used for monthly expenses, emptied except for $57. Credit cards maxed out on purchases I'd never made. Our mortgage payment, overdue for the first time in our marriage. Marcus walked through the front door at that moment, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his silver hair styled with that casual elegance that had first attracted me when we met at a networking event 8 years ago. He was laughing into his phone, completely oblivious to the destruction waiting for him in the kitchen. "Baby, I just closed the Henderson deal," he called out, still on his call. "We should celebrate tonight. Maybe that new sushi place downtown?" I held up the bank statement like evidence in a courtroom. His laugh died in his throat when he saw my face. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Now." Marcus ended his call without a goodbye, his expression shifting into what I now recognized as his crisis management mode. The same look he'd worn when his last startup failed, when his previous business partner sued him, when the IRS had questioned his tax filings. Charming smile, concerned eyes, hands raised in a gesture of innocent confusion. "Hey, what's wrong? You look upset about something." "Where is my money, Marcus?" He glanced at the statement in my hands, and for just a split second, I saw something flicker across his face. Not surprise, not confusion, but calculation. He was figuring out how much I knew, how much he could still hide. "What money?" "I don't understand what you're asking." "My savings account. $847,000. Gone." I placed the statement on the marble counter between us like a gauntlet. "Every penny I've saved for the past 15 years. Vanished." Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing, but now recognized as his tell when he was preparing to lie. "That's impossible. There must be some kind of mistake. Have you called the bank? Could be fraud, identity theft, something like that." "Cut the act, Marcus. I found the hotel receipts. I found the jewelry receipts. I know about Sophia. The name, hit him like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and the mask of confusion finally slipped away, revealing something I'd never seen before. Contempt. Not guilt, not remorse, but actual disdain for being caught. "It's not what you think," he said. But his tone had changed completely. Gone was the concerned husband, replaced by someone cold and strategic. "Then explain it to me. Explain how our accounts are empty. Explain who Sophia Martinez is and why you've been spending my money on her for the past 6 months." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those pale blue eyes that had once made me feel like the only woman in the world. Now they made me feel like a problem to be solved. "You wouldn't understand," he finally said. "You've never understood what it takes to build something significant. Every successful man needs certain kinds of support, certain kinds of inspiration." "Support? Is that what you call stealing my inheritance? Your grandmother's money was just sitting there earning nothing. At least I'm using it to build something, to create opportunities. Sophia understands that. She believes in my vision." The casual way he said it, like my life savings was pocket change he'd borrowed for coffee, ignited something volcanic inside me. This man I'd loved, supported, sacrificed for, was standing in our kitchen justifying theft as business strategy. "You stole from me," I whispered, the words barely audible. "I invested it," he corrected with infuriating calm, "in our future. The boutique fitness studio franchise is going to be huge. Sophia has incredible business instincts, plus the social media following to make it work. This isn't some affair. Elena, this is a partnership that's going to make us rich." Elena. He'd said my name like it tasted bitter, like I was an obstacle to his grand plans rather than the woman who'd stood by him through every failure, every setback, every harebrained scheme that had cost us money we couldn't afford to lose. "Get out?" I said quietly. "What?" "Get out of this house. Get out of my sight. Get out of my life." Marcus straightened, and I saw another side of him emerge. The one that had probably been there all along, hidden behind charm and manipulation. His voice turned sharp, cutting. "This is my house too, Elena. My name is on the deed. You can't just throw me out because you're having an emotional reaction to a sound business decision." Emotional reaction? My voice was rising now. 15. Years of suppressed frustrations and overlooked red flags finally finding their voice. "You stole nearly $1 million from me to fund your girlfriend's business. You've been lying to me for months, probably years." "Keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing toward the windows as if our neighbors might hear, always worried about appearances, about what people might think. "You're being hysterical." That word, hysterical, hung in the air between us like a slap. How many times had he used it to dismiss my concerns, my questions, my instincts? How many red flags had I ignored because I was supposedly being hysterical or paranoid or emotional? "I want you gone by morning," I said with deadly calm. "Take whatever you need, but I want you out of this house." Marcus laughed, laughed, shaking his head like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "That's not how divorce works, sweetheart. Community property state, remember? Half of everything is mine, including your precious inheritance. By the time the lawyers are done, you'll be lucky to keep this place, let alone anything else." He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne, the same scent that had once made me feel safe and desired. Now it made me nauseous. "Besides," he continued, his voice dropping to that intimate tone he used to use when trying to convince me of something, "do you really want to go through all that? The public humiliation? The legal fees? The friends choosing sides? Sophia's pregnant, Elena. This is bigger than just us now." The words hit me like ice water. Pregnant. Not only had he stolen my money and betrayed our marriage, but he'd created a new family while systematically destroying ours. The casual cruelty of it, the calculated destruction of everything I'd thought was real, left me breathless. But as I stood there in our designer kitchen, surrounded by the life we'd built together that had apparently been a lie, something unexpected happened. Instead of the devastating collapse I should have felt, instead of begging or pleading or falling apart, I felt something else entirely. Relief, pure, crystalline relief. Like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had suddenly lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I could see Marcus clearly. Not through the lens of love or hope or willful blindness, but exactly as he was. A thief. A liar. A man who'd spent 15 years of my life positioning himself to take everything I'd worked for. I walked to the kitchen drawer where we kept important papers and pulled out a business card I'd carried but never thought I'd need. My attorney's card, the one who'd handled my grandmother's estate. Elena, what are you doing? I picked up my phone and dialed the number, Marcus watching with growing alarm as the call connected. David? It's Elena Vasquez. I need to see you first. Thing tomorrow morning. It's urgent. As I ended the call, Marcus grabbed my wrist, his grip just tight enough to be uncomfortable. Don't do something you'll regret, he said quietly. Think about what you're risking here. Think about what you could lose. I looked down at his hand on my wrist, then back up at his face, and smiled for the first time in months. Marcus, I said sweetly, you have no idea what you've just activated. The story of how I met Marcus Rivera began 8 years earlier at the most boring networking event I'd ever attended. I was 28, wearing my one good business suit, and desperately trying to make connections that might advance my career at Hartwell Financial. As a junior analyst, I spent my days buried in spreadsheets and my evenings at events like this one, hoping to meet someone who might see potential in me beyond my ability to crunch numbers. Marcus stood out immediately. While everyone else clutched their wine glasses and exchanged business cards with practiced efficiency, he was holding court near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Columbia Tower, telling animated stories that had his small audience laughing genuinely. He was older than me by 12 years, with salt and pepper hair that somehow made him look distinguished rather than aging, and a confidence that filled the room. When our eyes met across the crowded reception, his smile was like being selected from a crowd of thousands. He excused himself from his conversation and walked directly to me, extending his hand with old-fashioned courtesy. I'm Marcus Rivera, he said, his voice warm and rich. And you look like the only person here who isn't. Trying to sell me something. I laughed despite my nervousness. Elena Vasquez. And I'm definitely trying to sell you something. Myself as a valuable business contact. Honest and beautiful. That's a dangerous combination. The line should have been cheesy, but something about his delivery made it feel sincere rather than practiced. We talked for 2 hours, long after the official networking portion had ended and people had begun filtering out to their cars. He told me about his latest venture, a tech startup focused on sustainable energy solutions. I shared my dreams of eventually starting my own financial consulting firm, maybe specializing in helping small businesses navigate complex growth phases. You should let me take you to dinner sometime, he said as we waited for the valet to bring our cars. I'd love to hear more about your business ideas. I have a feeling you're going to be very successful. Our first date was at Canlis, easily the most expensive restaurant I'd ever been to. Marcus ordered wine that cost more than my monthly grocery budget and seemed completely at ease in surroundings that made me hyper-aware of my department store dress. But he had a gift for making me feel like I belonged there, like I was sophisticated and worldly rather than a girl from Yakima who'd worked her way through college waiting tables. Tell me about your family, he said over the perfectly prepared salmon. I found myself sharing stories I rarely told anyone, about growing up with my grandmother after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, about how Abuela had cleaned office buildings at night to pay for my college textbooks, about how she'd taught me that money wasn't about spending but about security and choices. She sounds like an incredible woman, Marcus said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. No wonder you turned out so grounded and ambitious. The courtship that followed felt like something from a romantic movie. Marcus sent flowers to my office with handwritten notes that made my coworkers jealous. He took me to gallery openings and symphony performances, introducing me to a world of culture and sophistication I'd only read about. He listened intently when I talked about work, asking thoughtful questions that showed he genuinely respected my intelligence. Most importantly, he made me feel chosen. In a city full of beautiful, successful women, Marcus Rivera had picked me. The validation was intoxicating. 6 months into our relationship, he began including me in his business discussions. "I value your analytical mind," he'd say, showing me potential investment opportunities or asking my opinion on market trends. When his sustainable energy startup hit regulatory roadblocks, he sought my advice on financial restructuring options. "You should consider pivoting to consulting," I suggested during one of our late-night strategy sessions in his Capitol Hill loft. "Your network is incredible, and you understand emerging markets better than anyone I know." "That's brilliant," he said, kissing me with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just discovered treasure. "You're brilliant. Will you help me structure it?" I threw myself into helping Marcus launch Rivera Strategic Consulting with the same intensity I brought to my day job. Evenings and weekends were spent developing business plans, creating financial projections, and building client presentation materials. It felt like we were building something together, partners in every sense of the word. The first year was a struggle. Marcus's initial clients were mostly contacts from his previous ventures, and the revenue was inconsistent. I found myself covering more than my share of our expenses: dinners out, weekend trips, even his office rent when cash flow was tight. But I didn't mind. I believed in him, in us, in what we were building together. "This is temporary," he'd assure me when I discreetly picked up another check. "Once the business takes off, I'm going to spoil you rotten. You deserve everything, Elena." By our second year together, Rivera Strategic was gaining traction. Marcus landed several major clients, including a tech company preparing for acquisition, and a restaurant chain expanding into new markets. His confidence grew with his success, and our relationship deepened accordingly. The proposal came during a weekend trip to San Juan Island. We were walking along the beach after dinner when Marcus dropped to one knee, producing a ring that must have cost more than I made in 6 months. "Elena Vasquez," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've made me a better man and a better businessman. I can't imagine building a future without you. Will you marry me?" The ring was stunning, a 2-carat diamond surrounded by smaller stones, set in platinum. But what made me say yes wasn't the ring or the romantic setting. It was the look in Marcus's eyes, the way he seemed to see our entire future spread out before us like a golden path. Our wedding was everything I'd dreamed of but never thought I could afford. Marcus insisted on the 4 seasons, the full orchestra, the designer dress that required 3 fittings to perfect. "My wife deserves nothing but the best," he said whenever I questioned the expense. My grandmother, then 86 and still sharp as a tack, pulled me aside during the reception. She looked elegant in the dress we'd chosen together, but her expression was serious. "Mija," she said quietly, "this man, he spends money like water. Make sure you keep something that's just yours, entiendes? A woman always needs her own security." I laughed off her concern. "Abuela, Marcus is building a successful business. We're partners in everything." She squeezed my hand, her weathered fingers surprisingly strong. "Partners, see. But partnership doesn't mean you become invisible, Elena. Remember who you were before him." The early years of our marriage felt like vindication of my choice. Marcus's business continued growing, bringing in clients from across the Pacific Northwest. We bought the penthouse in Belltown, furnished it with pieces Marcus selected from high-end galleries. I was promoted to senior analyst at Hartwell, then to associate director, my salary increasing steadily. Marcus was supportive of my career advancement, at least initially. He'd brag to his clients about his brilliant wife and her success in finance. When I mentioned wanting to eventually start my own consulting firm, he encouraged the dream. When the time is right, he'd say, "We'll make it happen." Rivera and Vasquez Financial has a nice ring to it. But somewhere around our 3rd year of marriage, subtle changes began. Marcus's praise for my work became less frequent, replaced by gentle corrections about my workaholic tendencies. When I worked, late or traveled for business, he'd greet me with comments about how much he'd missed me, how the house felt empty without me. "Success is meaningless if you're too busy to enjoy it," he'd say, pulling me close. "Maybe it's time to think about scaling back, focusing on what really matters." What really matters, according to Marcus, was supporting his increasingly ambitious business goals. Rivera Strategic was expanding into new markets, requiring more capital investment and more of his time networking with potential investors. My role gradually shifted from equal partner to supportive spouse, my own career aspirations quietly set aside to facilitate his dreams. I told myself this was temporary, that once Marcus's business reached the next level, we'd circle back to my goals. I loved him, and successful marriages required sacrifice and compromise. The fact that most of the sacrificing seemed to be coming from my side was something I pushed to the back of my mind. My grandmother's death during our 4th year of marriage brought an inheritance that changed our financial picture dramatically. $600,000, carefully saved and invested over decades of cleaning offices and living frugally. She'd left it all to me with a note written in her careful handwriting. "For my Elena's future and independence. Use it wisely, mija." Marcus was appropriately sympathetic about my loss, but I noticed how quickly he began incorporating my inheritance into our financial planning discussions. Suddenly, there were opportunities to invest in real estate, to buy into promising startups, to leverage our new position for greater returns. "Your grandmother would want her money to grow," he'd argue when I expressed hesitation about his more aggressive investment suggestions. "She'd want us to be smart about building wealth." I kept the inheritance in my own account, adding to it regularly from my salary. It felt like maintaining a connection to my grandmother, honoring her sacrifices by being equally careful with money. Marcus occasionally mentioned how conservative I was being, how much more we could accomplish by pooling all our resources, but he didn't push. Not then. The changes in our relationship were so gradual, I barely noticed them happening. Marcus's requests for my help with client presentations became expectations. His suggestions about my appearance for business events became gentle but persistent. Corrections. His praise for my intelligence became qualified with concerns about my tendency to overthink situations. By our 6th year of marriage, I realized I'd become a supporting character in my own life. My dreams of financial consulting had been indefinitely postponed. My social circle had narrowed to Marcus's business contacts and their wives. My identity had merged so completely with his that I struggled to remember what I'd wanted for myself before becoming Mrs. Rivera. But I loved him. Despite the subtle erosion of my independence, despite the growing feeling that I was losing myself piece by piece, I genuinely loved my husband. He was charming, successful, and when he focused his attention on me, I still felt like the most important person in his world. It would take 3 more years and the discovery of $847,000 in missing funds for me to understand that love without respect isn't love at all. It's a beautifully decorated prison cell. The erosion of my marriage didn't happen overnight. Like water slowly carving through stone, Marcus's controlling behavior developed so gradually that I barely noticed each small boundary being crossed, each piece of my independence being chipped away. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly, but at the time, each incident seemed reasonable, even loving. It started with small suggestions about my appearance. During our 5th year of marriage, Marcus began commenting more frequently on my clothing choices for his business events. That dress is beautiful, sweetheart. But maybe something a little more conservative for tonight? Thompson's wife is very traditional, and I want to make sure we make the right impression. I'd change clothes without argument, telling myself that supporting his business meant adapting to his clients' expectations. When he started laying out outfits for important events, I accepted it as his way of showing he cared about details. The navy suit for the banking conference, the black cocktail dress for investor dinners, the understated jewelry that let my natural beauty shine through. "You have such exquisite taste," I'd tell him, and he'd beam with pride at the compliment. The comments about my work schedule began around the same time. Where Marcus had once admired my dedication to my career, he started expressing concern about the hours I was keeping. "You're working yourself to death, Elena. When was the last time? You took a real vacation?" When I mentioned that I was being considered for a promotion to director level at Hartwell Financial, his enthusiasm was notably muted. "That's wonderful, of course, but think about what that kind of position would mean for our life together. More travel, more late nights, more stress. Is it really worth it?" He had a point. The director position would require frequent travel to client sites and longer hours managing a larger team. But it also represented everything I'd worked toward since college: real influence, substantial compensation, the chance to shape financial strategy for major corporations. "We could use the salary increase," I pointed out during one of our discussions about the promotion. "It would help with the house payments. Maybe let us finally start that investment portfolio you've been talking about." Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "Money isn't everything, Elena. We're comfortable. Now, sometimes I feel like you're more interested in your career than in our marriage." The accusation stung because it forced me to examine my priorities. Was I being selfish by pursuing advancement? Were my professional ambitions threatening our relationship? Marcus had given up opportunities to spend more time with me. At least, that's how he framed his career changes. Maybe it was my turn to compromise. I withdrew my name from consideration for the promotion. Marcus's relief was palpable, and his gratitude was expressed through increased attention and affection. For several weeks, he was the charming, attentive husband I'd fallen in love with, bringing me flowers, planning romantic dinners, talking about our future together with renewed enthusiasm. "This is what matters," he'd say, holding me close as we watched the sunset from our penthouse balcony. "Us, building something beautiful together. I was worried for a while that work was becoming more important to you than we were." The guilt was effective. I threw myself into being a better wife, the kind of partner who prioritized relationship over career advancement. I turned down speaking opportunities at financial conferences, delegated more responsibility to my team so I could leave the office earlier, and focused on creating the kind of home life that would support Marcus's growing business. But supporting Marcus's business meant more than just being available for dinner parties and networking events. It meant active participation in ways that gradually consumed more of my time and energy. He'd ask me to review client proposals, leveraging my financial expertise to strengthen his presentations. I'd spend weekends creating detailed market analyses. For his pitches, drawing on my professional knowledge to give Rivera Strategic a competitive edge. "You're incredible," he'd tell me after I'd spent a Saturday morning perfecting financial projections for his latest client presentation. "I don't know what I'd do without your brilliant mind." The praise felt good, but I began to notice that my contributions were never acknowledged in the final presentations. When Marcus landed major clients using analysis I'd provided, the credit went entirely to him. When I mentioned this, he was quick to explain why acknowledgement would be problematic. "Client relationships are built on trust and consistency," he said. "If they know I'm relying on outside help, even from my wife, it undermines confidence in the firm. You understand business. Perception is reality in consulting." I did understand business, which is why his explanation made sense even as it felt somehow wrong. I continued providing research and analysis, telling myself that supporting my husband's success was supporting our shared future. The financial boundaries began shifting around our 6th year of marriage. Marcus had always been generous with spending, but he became increasingly casual about using my credit cards for business expenses. Just temporarily, he'd assure me when I questioned large charges on my statements. Cash flow is tight this month, but the Henderson contract will close soon and I'll reimburse everything. The reimbursements came, initially, but the pattern of using my accounts for his business needs became more frequent. When I expressed concern about mixing personal and business finances, Marcus was quick with reasonable explanations. We're married. Elena. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. This artificial separation you're maintaining isn't healthy for a partnership. He had a point about partnership, but something felt off about the way my financial independence was gradually dissolving. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. A woman always needs her own security. But voicing such concerns felt selfish and untrusting. The social isolation happened so gradually, I barely noticed it occurring. Marcus had always been particular about our social circle, preferring to spend time with people who could advance his business interests. But his preferences became more pronounced over time, and his criticisms of my friends became more frequent. Sarah means well, he'd say after my college roommate visited for the weekend, but she's still single at 35 for a reason. All that negative energy about men and relationships, it's not healthy for you to absorb. When my friend Lisa from work invited me to a girls' weekend in Portland, Marcus's reaction was swift and decisive. That sounds like fun, but it's the same weekend as the Morrison Industries dinner. You know how important that client is to the firm. There was always a conflict, always a business obligation that required my presence, always a reasonable explanation for why maintaining friendships outside our marriage was impractical. My social world contracted to Marcus's business associates and their wives, women who seemed perfectly content with their supporting roles in their husbands' enterprises. You're so lucky to have a husband who includes you in everything, said Jennifer Morrison, the wife of one of Marcus's major clients, during a particularly tedious dinner party. Some men just disappear into their work and leave their wives behind. I smiled and agreed, but privately wondered when being included had started to feel like being absorbed. The most insidious change was the way Marcus began questioning my judgment on financial matters. Despite my professional expertise in financial analysis, he started second-guessing my decisions about our personal investments and spending. I know you're conservative by nature, he'd say when I expressed concerns about his more aggressive investment strategies. But sometimes you have to take calculated risks to build real wealth. Your grandmother's approach worked for her generation, but the market is different now. When I suggested we needed to budget more carefully after a series of expensive purchases, new furniture, a luxury vacation, a boat that Marcus insisted we needed for client entertainment, his response was patronizing rather than collaborative. Sweetheart, I love how careful you are with money, but you're thinking like an employee rather than an entrepreneur's wife. We can't build wealth by penny pinching. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money. My professional expertise, once something Marcus praised and relied upon, became reframed as overly cautious thinking that held us back from achieving our true potential. My instincts about financial risk, honed through years of analyzing corporate investments, were dismissed as anxiety rather than wisdom. The gaslighting was subtle but persistent. When I'd remember conversations or agreements differently than Marcus did, he'd gently correct my recollection with such confidence that I began doubting my own memory. When I'd express concerns about our spending patterns or his business decisions, he'd redirect the conversation to my stress levels or hormonal fluctuations. Maybe you should see Dr. Peterson about your anxiety, he'd suggest after I'd questioned a particularly large expenditure. You've been so worried about everything lately. It's not like you to be this negative about our future. The suggestion that my legitimate concerns were symptoms of anxiety was particularly effective because it positioned him as the caring, rational spouse looking out for my well-being while casting me as the unstable partner whose judgment couldn't be trusted. By our 7th year of marriage, I'd become a ghost of my former self. The confident financial analyst who'd once dreamed of starting her own consulting firm had been replaced by a woman who second-guessed every instinct, every concern, every moment of resistance to her husband's increasingly controlling behavior. Told myself this was what mature marriage looked like: compromise, adaptation, choosing harmony over conflict. I told myself that successful couples functioned as units rather than individuals, that my grandmother's emphasis on independence was outdated thinking from a generation that hadn't understood modern partnership. But late at night, when Marcus was asleep beside me and the city lights cast shadows across our expensive furniture, I'd sometimes catch glimpses of who I used to be. The woman who'd worked her way through college, who'd earned promotions through competence and determination, who'd once believed she could accomplish anything she set her mind to. That woman felt like a character from someone else's story, person I'd once known but could barely remember. What I didn't understand yet was that Marcus hadn't just stolen my money. He'd been systematically stealing my sense of self for years, preparing the ground for the ultimate betrayal that would finally wake me up to what I'd lost. The foundation was crumbling long before I discovered the empty bank accounts. I just hadn't been allowed to notice the cracks. The morning that shattered my carefully constructed denial began like any other Tuesday. I was supposed to fly to Chicago for a 3-day client presentation at Hartwell Financial, a major pharmaceutical merger that required my expertise in corporate restructuring. My suitcase sat packed by the bedroom door, my presentation materials organized in my leather briefcase, my flight scheduled to depart at 10:30 a.m. But at 6:15 a.m., as I was applying my makeup in our marble-clad master bathroom, my phone buzzed, with a text from my client contact. Meeting postponed indefinitely due to regulatory complications. Will reschedule when situation clarifies. Apologies for short notice. Marcus was still asleep, his dark hair tousled against the Egyptian cotton. Pillowcases he'd insisted we needed. I debated waking him to share the news, but decided to let him rest. He'd been working late most nights recently, claiming that several major deals were reaching critical phases simultaneously. Instead, I quietly unpacked my suitcase and settled into my home office with coffee and the financial reports I'd planned to review on the plane. The unexpected day at home felt like a gift, unstructured time to catch up on personal tasks I'd been neglecting. By 9 a.m., I'd balanced our household accounts, scheduled overdue maintenance appointments, and responded to a backlog of personal emails. The domestic productivity felt satisfying in a way that surprised me. When was the last time I'd had an entire day with no professional obligations? I decided to surprise Marcus with his favorite breakfast, Belgian waffles with fresh steig, berries and real maple syrup. He'd been stressed lately, and the unexpected cancellation meant I could actually spend quality time with my husband for once. But as I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, carrying a breakfast tray with fresh coffee and warm waffles, I heard something. That stopped me cold. Marcus's voice, but not talking to me, talking on the phone in a tone I'd never heard before. Low, intimate, affectionate. "I miss you too, baby," he was saying. "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about how you felt in my arms." My hands began shaking so violently that the coffee cup rattled against the tray. I set it down, on the hallway console table, my legs suddenly unsteady. "Elena's in Chicago until Thursday," Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly through our bedroom door. "We have the whole day together. Why don't you come over around noon? I'll make that pasta you love and we can spend the afternoon in bed." The world tilted sideways. I gripped the console table, my knuckles white against the dark wood. Elena's in Chicago. He thought I was in Chicago. He was planning to bring another woman into our bed while I was supposedly traveling for work. "Sophia, sweetheart, you worry too much," Marcus was saying, and the name hit me like a physical blow. Sophia. This wasn't some random affair. This was someone he had pet names for, someone he cooked for, someone he made plans with. The business loan will go through, I promise. My wife's inheritance money is sitting there doing nothing anyway. She'll never even know it's gone. By the time the fitness studio is profitable, I'll have put it all back with interest. My wife's inheritance money. The room spun around me as the full scope of his betrayal became clear. He wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to steal my grandmother's money to fund his girlfriend's business venture. I love you too, Marcus said softly. You're the future I've been waiting for my whole life. Elena is she's the past. The safe choice I made when I was scared to take real risks. But you, baby, you inspire me to be the man I'm supposed to be. The safe choice. 7 years of marriage, and I was the safe choice he'd settled for, while waiting for his real future to arrive. I backed away from the door on trembling legs, my mind reeling with implications. How long had this been going on? How many business trips had he used as opportunities to betray me? How many late nights working had actually been spent with Sophia? My phone was in my purse downstairs. With shaking fingers, I pulled up our joint banking app, praying that what I'd overheard was still just planning rather than action. But my heart sank as the numbers loaded on the screen. Our savings account, which had contained $52,000 just a week ago, now showed a balance of $3,247. Our joint checking account was overdrawn by $800. The credit cards we barely used were suddenly maxed out with charges I didn't recognize. Expensive restaurants I'd never been to, luxury hotels, jewelry stores. But the worst discovery was yet to come. With growing dread, I accessed my personal savings account, the one containing my grandmother's inheritance that I'd been carefully growing for the past 4 years. The account that represented my security, my independence, my grandmother's decades of sacrifice, zero balance, not just withdrawn, completely emptied, with a transfer dated 2 days ago to an account I didn't recognize. $847,000 gone. I ran to the bathroom and vomited, my body's physical response to emotional devastation. Marcus's voice continued drifting from the bedroom, making plans with his girlfriend using my money, in my house, while lying about my whereabouts. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking in its completeness. This wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment or a midlife crisis affair. This was systematic fraud, emotional manipulation, and financial theft executed over months while he looked me in the eye every day and told me he loved me. I stood in our bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror he'd chosen. In the house we'd bought together, wearing the silk robe he'd given me for our anniversary, and realized I was looking at a stranger. The confident woman I'd once been had been so thoroughly erased that I barely recognized myself. But as I stood there, something unexpected happened. Instead of the collapse I should have felt, instead of the devastating heartbreak that would have been natural, I felt something else entirely. Clarity. For years, I'd been making excuses for Marcus's behavior, rationalizing away red flags, accepting his explanations for things that didn't make sense. I'd been gaslighted so effectively that I'd stopped trusting my own instincts, my own perceptions, my own judgment about what was healthy and normal in a marriage. But this was undeniable. This was criminal fraud, not a relationship problem that could be solved through better communication or couples therapy. I heard Marcus ending his phone call, telling Sophia he'd see her soon, that he loved her, that she was his perfect woman. The casual cruelty of it, discussing their future while stealing from me to fund it, crystallized something that had been building for months. I wasn't just being betrayed, I was being strategically destroyed. My phone buzzed with a text. From Marcus. Good morning, beautiful. Hope your presentation goes well today. Missing you already. Can't wait to hear all about Chicago when you get back. The performance was so complete, so calculated, that it took my breath away. He was texting me loving messages while planning to spend the day in our bed with another woman, using money he'd stolen from me to build a future that didn't include. I screenshot the message, some instinct telling me I'd need evidence of his deception. Then I opened my laptop and began documenting everything. The empty accounts, the credit card charges, the overheard phone conversation. My financial analyst training kicked in, and I began building a case with the same methodical precision I'd use for a corporate fraud investigation, because that's what this was. Fraud. Marcus Rivera, the man I'd loved and supported and sacrificed, was a thief who'd spent 7 years positioning himself to steal everything I'd worked for. As I heard him getting dressed in the bedroom, probably preparing for his girlfriend's arrival, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront him yet. I wasn't going to break down or beg for explanations or give him the opportunity to gaslight me again. Instead, I was going to be strategic. I was going to protect what was left of my assets, document his crimes, and consult with professionals. Who could help me understand my legal options? The scared, doubting woman who'd been questioning her own perceptions for years was gone. In her place was someone harder, clearer, and absolutely done with being manipulated. Marcus came downstairs 20 minutes later, freshly showered and whistling. He kissed my cheek with practiced affection, the same lips that had been telling another woman he loved her. "Thought you'd be in Chicago by now," he said casually. "Flight was canceled," I replied, my voice steady. "Regulatory issues with the client." "Oh, that's too bad. Well, maybe it's a blessing in disguise. We never get unplanned time together anymore." The ease of his deception was staggering. He stood in our kitchen, drinking coffee I'd made for him, preparing to betray me in our own home, and his performance never wavered. "Actually, I thought I'd spend the day running errands," I said. "Maybe do some shopping, catch up with friends, since I have the unexpected free time." Something flickered across his face. Disappointment? Alarm? But his smile remained steady. "That sounds perfect. You deserve some fun time. I'll probably work from home today, catch up on some client proposals. Client proposals. That's what he was calling it now. I gathered my purse and keys, kissing him goodbye with the same casual affection I'd shown for 7 years. But everything had changed. The woman walking out of that penthouse was not the same one who'd climbed the stairs with a breakfast tray an hour earlier. I had work to do, and for the first time in years, I was working for myself. The law offices of Patterson, Wells & Associates occupied the 32nd floor of the Columbia Center, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Elliott Bay. I'd been here once before, 4 years ago, when my grandmother's estate was being settled. David Patterson had been my grandmother's attorney for over 2 decades, a man she'd trusted with her most important financial decisions. Now, sitting in his mahogany-paneled office with my laptop full of evidence and a stack of bank statements, I felt like I was honoring her memory in a way she would have understood completely. "Elena," David said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the documents I'd presented. "I have to say, in 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen fraud this systematic or this brazen. Your husband has essentially conducted a financial dismantling of your assets over several months." David was in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of calm, methodical manner that came from handling high-stakes legal matters for decades. He'd known my grandmother well enough to attend her funeral, and I could see genuine anger in his usually placid expression as he absorbed the scope of Marcus's theft. "The good news," he continued, "is that you've documented everything meticulously. The unauthorized transfers, the credit card fraud, the clear evidence of adultery. It's all here in black and white. But Elena, there's something else we need to discuss." He opened a file folder that had been sitting on his desk when I arrived. "When your grandmother's estate was settled, she included some provisions that we haven't discussed since then. Specifically, a trust fund that was set up with very particular activation conditions. My grandmother's trust fund. I remembered vague mentions of it during the estate proceedings, but the inheritance I'd received had seemed so substantial that I hadn't focused on additional provisions. What kind of activation conditions? I asked. David pulled out a document that bore my grandmother's distinctive signature. Your grandmother was a remarkably astute woman. She established what's called a crisis protection trust, a financial mechanism designed to activate only under specific circumstances that would indicate you were in serious danger, particularly from a spouse or domestic partner. He pointed to a section of dense legal text. The trust contains approximately $600 million, accumulated through her investments over 60 years. But it only becomes accessible if certain conditions are met. Documented evidence of spousal, financial abuse, adultery with clear intent to defraud, or threats to your physical or economic safety. $600 million. The number was so staggering that I couldn't immediately process it. My grandmother, who had cleaned office buildings and lived in a modest apartment, had secretly amassed a fortune that could buy entire companies. Don't understand, I said weakly. How did she have that kind of money? She lived so simply. David smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from him since I'd arrived. Your grandmother was one of the most intelligent investors I've ever encountered. She started buying Boeing stock in the 1960s when it was trading for pennies. She invested in Microsoft in 1975, Amazon in 1997, Apple before the iPhone existed. She lived modestly by choice, not necessity. The revelation was overwhelming. My grandmother, who had worried about the cost of groceries, who had mended her clothes rather than buying new ones, who had worked night shifts well into her 70s, had been secretly building a fortune that could have changed both our lives, completely. Why didn't she tell me? I asked. Because, David said gently, she believed that knowing about the trust would either make you a target for exactly the kind of man you married, or would prevent you from developing your own strength and judgment. She wanted you to build your own life, make your own choices, learn your own lessons. The trust was her insurance policy, not her gift. He opened another folder containing what appeared to be a letter in my grandmother's handwriting. She left. Instructions for me to give you this only if the trust conditions were ever met. With trembling hands, I took the letter and began to read. Mi querida Elena, if you are reading this, it means that my worst fears have come true. Someone has tried to take advantage of your generous heart and steal your security. I am sorry you have had to learn this lesson the hard way, but I know you will emerge stronger. The money in this trust represents every sacrifice I made, every extra shift I worked, every penny I saved instead of spending on myself. I did this, not because I didn't trust you to be successful, but because I knew that success sometimes makes us targets for people who would rather steal than build. You have everything you need to rebuild your life exactly as you choose. Use this money wisely, not to return to what was, but to create what should be. And remember, mija, a woman's true security comes not from any man's promises, but from her own strength and wisdom. I am proud of you for being strong enough to ask for help. Now be strong enough to start again. Con amor siempre, abuela. Tears blurred my vision as I finished reading. My grandmother had known. Somehow she had anticipated exactly this scenario and had spent decades quietly preparing to protect me from it. The activation process is straightforward, David explained as I composed myself. Based on the evidence you've provided, the trust conditions have clearly been met. I'll file the necessary paperwork today, and the funds will be available to you within 48 hours. What about Marcus? I asked. What are my legal options regarding the money he stole? David's expression hardened. We'll be filing both civil and criminal complaints. The civil case will recover your stolen assets plus damages. The criminal case will likely result in charges for wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. Given the amounts involved and the interstate nature of some of the transactions, federal charges are also possible. The legal machinery that would destroy Marcus's life was already in motion, but I felt no satisfaction in it. only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion from years of being manipulated and betrayed. "There's one more thing," David said. "The trust includes provisions for immediate, protective measures. We can freeze all joint assets, secure restraining orders if necessary, and establish temporary spousal support obligations that run in your favor. Essentially, we can ensure that Marcus has no access to any remaining shared resources while legal proceedings are ongoing." The irony was perfect. Marcus had stolen my inheritance to fund his new life with Sophia, but in doing so, he had activated a financial mechanism that would give me resources beyond his wildest imagination, while simultaneously destroying any claim he might have had to our shared assets. "I want to proceed with everything," I said firmly. "All of it. The trust activation, the asset recovery, the criminal charges. Everything." David nodded with professional satisfaction. "I'll begin the filings immediately. In the meantime, I strongly recommend that you don't return home alone. Men like your husband often become dangerous when they realize their schemes have been discovered, especially when significant money is involved." The warning sent a chill through me. I'd been so focused on the financial betrayal that I hadn't considered the possibility of physical danger. But Marcus had already demonstrated his willingness to lie, steal, and manipulate without conscience. What else might he be capable of when cornered? "I have a colleague who specializes in domestic security situations," David continued, handing me another business card. "Catherine Morris. She can arrange secure accommodation and personal protection until we know how your husband will react to the legal proceedings." As I left David's office, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hope you're having a fun day out. Can't wait to see you tonight. Love you." The casual manipulation in that message, sent while he was probably still in our bed with Sophia, crystallized the full scope of his deception. For months, possibly years, every interaction between us had been calculated performance, designed to keep me compliant, while he systematically stole from me. But Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated my grandmother's love and her foresight. The woman who had worked night shifts to pay for my education had also worked them to ensure I would never be trapped by a man who saw me only as a source of funding for his real life. Walking through downtown Seattle toward the parking garage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete financial independence. Not the modest security I'd built through my own work, but the kind of generational wealth that could reshape entire lives, fund new ventures, or simply provide the ultimate insurance against ever being vulnerable to someone like Marcus again. My phone rang as I reached my car. The caller ID showed my home number. "Elena?" Marcus's voice was tight with controlled panic. "Where are you? I've been calling your cell." "Running errands," I said calmly. "Why?" "Someone from a law firm called the house asking for you. Something. About estate matters? And there was a weird call from our bank about account security reviews. I'm probably just being paranoid, but it felt strange." The legal and financial machinery was already beginning to move. Marcus could sense that something was shifting, but he couldn't yet grasp the magnitude of what was coming. "I'll be home soon," I said. "We can talk about it then." But I wouldn't be going home. At least, not to the penthouse that had been my prison for the past 7 years. Thanks to my grandmother's foresight, I would never have to depend on Marcus Rivera for anything, ever again. The trust fund wasn't just money, it was freedom. And for the first time since I'd discovered my empty bank accounts that morning, I smiled. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel felt like stepping into a different world. One where I wasn't Mrs. Marcus Rivera, the carefully managed wife whose every move had been subtly controlled for years. Catherine Morris had arranged a suite on the 20th floor under a name that couldn't be traced back to me, complete with security protocols that made me feel simultaneously protected and slightly paranoid. Catherine herself was nothing like I'd expected from a security consultant. She was perhaps 45, with short auburn hair and the kind of understated confidence that suggested she'd handled situations far more dangerous than mine. She met me in the hotel's ornate lobby, wearing a simple black suit that probably concealed more protective equipment than I wanted to think about. "Elena," she said, extending a firm handshake. "David Patterson briefed me on your situation. I know this feels overwhelming, but you've taken exactly the right steps to protect yourself." In my suite, a sprawling space with panoramic views of the Sound, Catherine laid out what she called a transition security plan with the same methodical precision I'd once used for financial presentations. "Your husband will likely go through several phases as he realizes what's happening," she explained, consulting notes that suggested she'd handled similar cases before. Initial confusion when the legal papers are served, followed by anger when he understands the scope of the charges against him, then potentially desperation when he grasps the financial implications. She opened a laptop and showed me surveillance footage from our building's lobby, captured just 2 hours earlier. Marcus was visible pacing frantically in front of the concierge desk, his usual composed demeanor completely shattered. "He's already trying to locate you," Catherine noted. "Called your office claiming it was a family emergency. Contacted 3 of your former colleagues. Even tried to reach your doctor's office asking about appointments." The systematic nature of his search was both flattering and terrifying. Marcus was applying the same strategic thinking he used in business to hunting me down, treating my disappearance as a problem to be solved through persistence and connections. My phone, which Catherine had secured with additional privacy protections, buzzed constantly with calls and texts from Marcus. His messages evolved from confused, "Where are you? I'm worried," to frustrated, "This isn't like you, Elena. Call me back," to angry, "Whatever game you're playing needs to stop now." "Don't respond to any of them," Catherine advised. "Every communication gives him information about your emotional state and potentially your location. Let him wonder." That evening, room service delivered dinner that I ate while Catherine briefed me on the legal proceedings that were unfolding in my absence. David Patterson had moved with impressive speed. Asset freezing orders had been filed, criminal complaints were being processed, and the trust fund activation was nearly complete. "By tomorrow morning," Catherine said, reviewing documents on her tablet, "you'll have access to more money than most people see in several lifetimes. The question is, what do you want to do with that freedom?" It was the first time anyone had asked me what I wanted in years. The question felt almost foreign, like being asked to speak a language I'd once been fluent in but had forgotten through disuse. "I need to think about it," I admitted. For so long, my goals were tied to Marcus's plans, to our shared future. "I'm not sure I remember what I wanted for myself before all that." Catherine nodded with understanding. "That's common in situations like yours. Systematic control often includes the gradual erosion of individual identity. The good news is that identity can be rebuilt, often stronger than before." That night, alone in a hotel room that cost more per night than I used to spend on groceries in a month, I tried to remember who Elena Vasquez had been before she became Mrs. Marcus Rivera, the ambitious young analyst who'd dreamed of starting her own consulting firm. The woman who'd worked her way through college and earned promotions through competence rather than connections. She felt like a character from someone else's story, but as I sat by the windows overlooking the city where I'd lived for over a decade, fragments of that person began emerging from the careful burial Marcus had orchestrated. The next morning brought news that changed everything again. Catherine arrived at my suite with coffee and a grim expression that immediately put me on alert. "We have a development," she said, opening her laptop to show me a local news website. The headline made my blood freeze. "Prominent Seattle businessman accused of massive financial fraud." The article was brief but devastating. Marcus Rivera, founder of Rivera Strategic Consulting, was facing federal charges for wire fraud and embezzlement involving amounts exceeding $800,000. His business was under investigation, his assets frozen, and several clients were reportedly reviewing their contracts for potential civil action. "How did this get out so fast?" I asked, Federal cases often generate press attention once charges are filed, Catherine explained. But there's more. Your husband held a press conference yesterday evening. She pulled up a video that made my stomach drop. Marcus stood in front of our building, looking haggard but defiant, speaking directly to news cameras with the same charismatic confidence he'd once used to win over clients and investors. My wife is suffering from a severe psychological breakdown, he was saying, his voice heavy with practiced concern. Elena has been struggling with paranoid delusions and erratic behavior for months. This entire situation is the result of her untreated mental health crisis, not any wrongdoing on my part. The performance was masterful. Marcus managed to look like a devoted husband worried about his unstable wife while simultaneously positioning himself as the victim of false accusations. Several reporters asked follow-up questions about my mental state, my history of erratic behavior, and whether he'd sought professional help for my condition. She's disappeared, Marcus continued, his voice breaking slightly with what appeared to be genuine emotion. I'm terrified that in her current state, she might harm herself or others. I'm begging anyone who sees Elena to contact authorities immediately. She needs help, not legal proceedings based on her delusions. The video ended with Marcus providing a recent photo of me, one taken at a charity event where I looked particularly tired and stressed, along with his contact information for anyone with information about my whereabouts. He's flipped the C. Entire narrative, I said, my voice barely audible. He's made me the villain in my own story. Catherine closed the laptop with decisive finality. This is actually good news, she said, surprising me completely. How is public humiliation good news? Because he's overplayed his hand. By making specific claims about your mental state and behavior, he's created a legal vulnerability. Every statement he made can be challenged in court with evidence of his fraud, his affair, and his systematic theft. He's also potentially committed defamation, which gives us additional grounds for civil action. She pulled out her phone and made a quick call. David? Catherine Morris. Did you see the press conference? Good. I think it's time for Elena to tell her side of the story. The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparation. David Patterson arrived at the hotel with a publicist who specialized in crisis management, a woman named Sarah Chen who had apparently handled similar cases involving financial fraud and domestic abuse. The narrative your husband is trying to establish won't survive contact with evidence, Sarah assured me as we reviewed strategy. Bank records don't lie. Federal investigators don't pursue cases based on delusional accusations. We're going to let the facts speak for themselves. The press conference we held that afternoon was nothing like Marcus's emotional performance. Flanked by David and Catherine, I read a prepared statement that laid out the basic facts without theatrical flourishes, systematic theft of marital assets, documented adultery, evidence of fraud spanning multiple months. I'm not suffering from any mental health crisis, I said, looking directly into the news cameras. I'm a woman who discovered her husband was stealing money to fund an affair, and I'm using legal means to protect myself and recover what was taken from me. The questions from reporters were predictably focused on the dramatic elements: the missing money, the other woman, the federal charges. But I stuck to the facts, letting the evidence speak rather than engaging in emotional appeals or personal attacks. The most important moment came when a reporter asked about Marcus's claims regarding my psychological state. Anyone who knows me professionally can attest to my competence and stability, I replied. I've been a senior financial analyst at Hartwell Financial for over 8 years. I've managed multi-million-dollar corporate accounts and advised on major mergers and acquisitions. The idea that I'm delusional or unstable is not only false, but insulting to every client who has trusted me with their financial futures. By evening, the story had shifted completely. Financial industry colleagues who had worked with me for years came forward to provide character references. Hartwell Financial issued a statement supporting my professional competence and expressing confidence in my judgment. Even former clients offered testimonials about my analytical skills and ethical standards. Marcus's attempt to paint me as an unstable, delusional woman had backfired spectacularly. Instead of discrediting my accusations, it had prompted a wave of professional support that undermined his entire narrative. That night, alone in my hotel suite with the city lights sparkling below, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride in standing up for myself, for speaking truth without apology, for refusing to be silenced by shame or manipulation. My phone buzzed with a final text from Marcus. "You have no idea what you've just destroyed. I hope it was worth it." I deleted the message without responding. What I'd destroyed was a lie. What I'd found was myself. 6 months after Marcus's world collapsed in federal court, I stood in the corner office of my own financial consulting firm, watching the morning sun cast geometric shadows across Elliott Bay. The space occupied the entire 42nd floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views I'd once only dreamed of affording. The brass nameplate on my desk read, "Elena Vasquez, CEO." Not Mrs. Rivera, not Marcus's wife, but the woman I'd chosen to become. Vasquez Strategic Financial had grown from a single-person operation to a team of 12 specialists in just 4 months. We focused exclusively on helping women navigate complex financial transitions, divorce proceedings, inheritance management, business acquisitions, and fraud recovery. Word had spread quickly through Seattle's professional networks that Elena Vasquez was the person to call when you needed someone who understood both the technical and emotional complexities of financial betrayal. My assistant, Jennifer, knocked on my open door. "Elena, your 10 o'clock is here. Dr. Amanda Sterling, the cardiac surgeon going through the divorce?" Dr. Sterling entered my office with the controlled composure I recognized in all my clients. Women who had built successful careers only to discover that their personal lives had been systematically undermined by partners they'd trusted completely. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair and the kind of focused intensity that came from making life-or-death decisions in operating rooms. "Ms. Vasquez," she said, settling into the leather chair across from my desk. "My attorney recommended you specifically. She said you'd understand what I'm dealing with in ways that other financial advisors might not." I opened the file my team had prepared based on her initial consultation. Dr. Sterling's situation was depressingly familiar. A 20-year marriage to a man who had gradually assumed control of their finances while she focused on her medical practice. Now, facing divorce proceedings, she'd discovered that their joint assets had been systematically transferred to accounts she couldn't access, investments she'd never approved, and business ventures that seemed designed more to hide money than generate returns. "Your husband has been very sophisticated about asset concealment," I told her, reviewing the analysis my forensic accounting team had prepared. "But the good news is that sophistication often creates more evidence, not less. We've identified at least 12 separate transactions that appear to violate fiduciary duty, and 3 that may constitute outright fraud." Over the next hour, I walked Dr. Sterling through the recovery strategy we'd developed, explaining how we'd work with her legal team to trace hidden assets while simultaneously protecting her from further financial manipulation. It was work that combined my technical expertise with hard-won understanding of how financial abuse functioned within seemingly successful marriages. "The emotional component is often harder than the financial component," I told her as our meeting concluded. "You'll discover things about your husband that will make you question your own judgment about people. That's normal, and it passes. What matters is that you're taking action to protect yourself now." After Dr. Sterling left, I walked to my windows overlooking the Sound, remembering how different this view looked from the penthouse I'd shared with Marcus. From there, the city had seemed like something to be conquered or impressed. From here, it looked like a community where I could contribute something meaningful. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Morris. "Coffee this afternoon? Have an update on the Rivera case." Catherine had become more than my security consultant over the past months. She'd evolved into something like a friend, one of the few people who fully understood the journey from victim to survivor, to something beyond both those labels. We met regularly to discuss not just security protocols, but the broader challenge of rebuilding identity after systematic manipulation. That afternoon, at a quiet cafe in Pioneer Square, Catherine slid a legal document across our table. Final. Judgment came through this morning, she said. Marcus pled guilty to all federal charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, 7 years in federal prison, full restitution of stolen assets, and permanent forfeiture of any claim to your inherited funds, 7 years. The number seemed both too much and too little for what Marcus had done. Not just the financial theft, but the systematic erosion of my sense of self over nearly a decade of marriage. But prison time had never been the point for me. The point had been stopping him from doing the same thing to other women. "What about Sophia?" I asked. Catherine's expression darkened slightly. "She's facing civil charges for receiving stolen funds, but criminal prosecution is unlikely. Apparently she claims she didn't know the money for her fitness studio came from fraudulent sources." I felt a flicker of the old anger, but it was distant now, like an echo from someone else's life. Sophia Martinez had been as much a victim of Marcus's manipulation as I had been, just in a different way. He'd used my money to fund their relationship, while lying to both of us about his intentions and circumstances. "There's something else," Catherine continued. "The federal investigation uncovered evidence that you weren't Marcus's first victim. Apparently, his previous marriage ended under similar circumstances: financial irregularities, missing assets, claims of spousal mental instability. That woman was never able to prove fraud because she didn't have the resources to fight him, legally." The revelation was both horrifying and validating. Marcus Rivera had been a serial financial predator, someone who specialized in targeting successful women, isolating them gradually, then systematically stealing their assets while positioning himself as the victim of their instability. I'd been lucky. My grandmother's foresight and David Patterson's expertise had given me tools that Marcus's previous victim hadn't possessed. "I'd like to reach out to her," I said. "The first wife. Maybe our firm can help her recover something, even after all this time." Catherine nodded approvingly. "I thought you might say that. Her name is Rebecca Morrison. She's been following your case through the news coverage." That evening, I called Rebecca Morrison from my office after hours. Her voice carried the same careful control I remembered from my own early conversations with attorneys and investigators. The sound of someone who had learned to guard every word because previous honesty had been used against her. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, "my name is Elena Vasquez. I believe we have an unfortunate connection through Marcus Rivera." The silence that followed lasted so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Rebecca Morrison began to cry. Not the quiet tears of sadness, but the deep, shaking sobs of someone finally being believed after years of having their truth dismissed. "I knew it," she whispered when she could speak again. "I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew he'd stolen from me. But everyone said I was bitter about the divorce, paranoid, delusional. Even my own attorney thought I was imagining things." We talked for over an hour. Rebecca's story was eerily similar to mine. The gradual financial control, the gaslighting about her mental state, the systematic asset transfer disguised as investment opportunities. But Rebecca had been 20 years younger when it happened, with fewer resources and less professional credibility to draw upon when Marcus had painted her as an unstable ex-wife, making false accusations. "I lost everything," she told me. "Not just the money, but my confidence, my sense of reality. It took me years to trust my own judgment about anything." By the end of our conversation, I'd offered to have my forensic accounting team review her case files to see what might still be recoverable, even a decade later. I'd also invited her to visit Seattle to meet with my staff and explore whether some form of justice might still be possible. "Why are you doing this?" Rebecca asked. You've already won your case. You don't owe me anything." "Because," I said, staring out at the city lights that had become my new home in every sense, "no one should have to go through what we went through alone." And because Marcus Rivera spent years using his victims' isolation against them, the best revenge is making sure that stops here. 3 weeks later, Rebecca Morrison flew to Seattle for a consultation that turned into something much more significant. My team had identified several asset transfers from her marriage that exceeded the statute of limitations for criminal prosecution, but might still be recoverable through civil action. More importantly, her documentation from the 1990s provided crucial pattern evidence that supported fraud charges against Marcus that could extend his prison sentence. But the most meaningful moment came when Rebecca met with some of my current clients, other women navigating financial betrayal and manipulation. Seeing her speak about her experience, about the years she'd spent doubting her own perceptions, provided them with perspective that no financial analysis could offer. "The money matters," Rebecca told Dr. Sterling during one of these informal support sessions I'd started hosting monthly. "But getting your sanity back matters more. Knowing that you weren't crazy, that your instincts were right, that you deserve better. That's worth more than any settlement." 6 months later, Vasquez Strategic Financial had expanded to include a victim advocacy division, staffed by social workers and therapists who specialized in financial abuse recovery. We were handling cases across the Pacific Northwest, and I'd been invited to speak at conferences about the intersection of domestic abuse and white-collar crime. But the most satisfying development was personal. I'd begun dating again, cautiously with extensive background checks that Catherine Morris performed discreetly, and discovered that I could trust my own judgment about people when that judgment wasn't being systematically undermined by someone with ulterior motives. Michael Chen was the environmental attorney who specialized in corporate accountability cases. We'd met at a conference where we were both presenting on different aspects of financial crime. He was intelligent, funny, and refreshingly straightforward about his intentions and background. Most importantly, he understood why I needed transparency and honesty in ways that most people wouldn't. "I know this sounds clinical," I told him after our third date, "but I'm going to need you to consent to a comprehensive background check before this relationship goes any further." Michael had laughed, but not dismissively. "Given what you've been through, I'd be concerned if you didn't protect yourself that way. Catherine Morris, right? She checked me out before our first coffee date." That night, as I sat in my own home, a renovated Victorian in Capitol Hill that I'd bought with my own money, decorated according to my own taste, secured according to my own security requirements, I reflected on the woman I'd become, the terrified wife who'd discovered empty bank accounts 18 months ago felt like someone from another lifetime. In her place was a businesswoman who employed 12 people, an advocate who'd helped dozens of women recover millions in stolen assets, and a person who had learned the difference between love and control, between partnership and possession. Grandmother's letter remained framed on my office wall, a daily reminder of the foresight and sacrifice that had made my freedom possible. But increasingly, I understood that the trust fund hadn't just provided money. It had provided choices. The choice to rebuild rather than simply survive, to help others rather than hide from the world, to trust again rather than remain forever guarded. Marcus Rivera was serving his sentence in federal prison, his name permanently associated with financial fraud and domestic abuse. His consulting firm had been dissolved, his professional licenses revoked, his reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. But I was thriving in ways that had nothing to do with his downfall, and everything to do with the authentic life I'd built from the ashes of his betrayal. The best revenge I'd learned wasn't his punishment. It was my success. 2 years later, I stood before a packed auditorium at the Seattle Convention Center, looking out at over 800 faces. Financial advisors, attorneys, social workers, and women who had survived experiences similar to mine. The annual Financial Empowerment Summit had grown from a small workshop I'd hosted in my office conference room to the largest gathering of its kind on the West Coast. When I discovered that my husband had stolen my life savings to fund his affair, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. I thought my world was ending. What I didn't understand then was that it was actually beginning. The opening always drew complete silence from the audience. After 2 years of speaking publicly about financial abuse, I'd learned that this particular story, the wine thrown in my face at a charity gala seemed like someone else's story now, resonated across demographics and income levels. Financial betrayal knew no boundaries of education, profession, or social status. In the front row sat Rebecca Morrison, now the Director of Victim Advocacy at Vasquez Strategic Financial. Beside her was Dr. Amanda Sterling, who had become not just a client, but a close friend and frequent speaker at our events. Their presence reminded me daily that healing wasn't a solitary journey. It was something that happened in community, through connection, by helping others navigate paths. We'd walked ourselves. The prenuptial agreement that my grandmother insisted upon saved my assets, I continued. But what saved me was understanding that survival and recovery are just the beginning of a much larger story. The question isn't just how do we protect ourselves from financial predators. It's how do we use our experiences to build something meaningful from the wreckage. As I spoke, I could see faces in the audience that I recognized, women I'd worked with over the past 2 years, some just beginning their journeys out of abusive financial relationships, others who had already rebuilt their lives and were now helping guide others. Each story was unique in its details but universal in its themes. Trust betrayed, assets stolen, identity systematically eroded, then gradually reclaimed. The keynote address had become my signature presentation, but it had evolved significantly from my early speaking engagements. Initially, I'd focused primarily on the practical aspects of financial recovery, how to document abuse, work with forensic accountants, navigate legal proceedings. But over time, I'd realized that the technical elements, while crucial, were only part of a much larger transformation process. Financial abuse isn't just about money, I told the audience. It's about control, about isolation, about systematically convincing someone that their own perceptions can't be trusted. The stolen assets are devastating, but the stolen sense of self is often much harder to recover. During the Q&A session that followed, a woman in her 50s raised her hand. Ms. Vasquez, how do you rebuild trust in your own judgment after years of being told you're wrong about everything? The question took me back to those early months after Marcus's arrest, when I'd second-guessed every decision from what to eat for breakfast to major business strategies. The erosion of confidence that came from sustained gaslighting wasn't something that could be repaired overnight through legal victories or financial settlements. It happens gradually, I replied, and it happens through practice. Every small decision you make independently, every time you trust your instincts and they prove correct, every boundary you set and maintain, it all rebuilds that confidence incrementally. For me, starting my business was crucial because it gave me concrete evidence that my judgment could be trusted with important matters. After the formal presentation, I moved to the networking reception where I'd learned some of my most meaningful conversations happened. Away from the stage and microphones, women felt more comfortable sharing the details of their situations, asking for specific advice, or simply finding validation that their experiences were real and their responses reasonable. Near the refreshment table, I encountered a young woman who looked familiar but whom I couldn't immediately place. She was perhaps 28, professionally dressed, but with the carefully controlled composure I'd learned to recognize in recent victims of financial abuse. Ms. Vasquez? She said tentatively. My name is Lisa Chen. I attended your workshop last month about recognizing early warning signs. I remembered her now. She'd sat in the back row taking extensive notes, but hadn't spoken during the discussion period. Something about her demeanor had suggested she was dealing with an active situation rather than seeking general education. Lisa, of course. How have you been? She glanced around nervously before answering. I followed your advice about documentation. Bank statements, credit reports, recording conversations. You were right. Once I started looking carefully, the pattern was undeniable. Over the next 20 minutes, Lisa shared her story in hushed tones. Her husband of 3 years had been gradually assuming control of their finances, using her student loan debt and credit score as justification for consolidating everything under his management. She'd discovered that he'd been systematically transferring money from their joint accounts to investment vehicles she didn't understand, while simultaneously running up debt in her name. The worst part, she said, is that he's so logical about everything. He has spreadsheets and projections and reasonable explanations for every transaction. When I question anything, he makes me feel like I'm being paranoid or financially illiterate. I handed her the business card of Sarah Kim, one of the forensic accountants on my team who specialized in cases involving investment fraud and debt manipulation. Sarah is brilliant at unraveling complex financial schemes, I told Lisa. More importantly, she understands that what looks like sophisticated investment strategy is often just elaborate theft. As Lisa walked away with contact, information, and a clear next step, I felt the familiar satisfaction that had become my primary motivation for this work. Each woman who gained clarity about her situation, each person who developed the tools to protect herself, each story that ended with recovery rather than devastation, they were the real measure of success for everything I'd built. Michael appeared at my elbow with a glass of wine and the kind of supportive smile that had characterized our relationship from the beginning. We'd been together for 18 months now, and he'd become an integral part of both my personal life and my professional mission. His legal expertise in corporate accountability cases complemented my work perfectly, and several of my clients had benefited from his guidance on complex litigation matters. Great presentation, he said, kissing my cheek lightly. I particularly liked the section about rebuilding professional identity after systematic undermining. That's something I don't think gets discussed enough in recovery literature. Michael's ability to engage intellectually with my work while still providing emotional support continued to surprise me. Marcus had been threatened by my professional competence and had worked consistently to undermine it. Michael seemed genuinely proud of what I'd accomplished and eager to help me achieve even more. Any word from the publisher about the book proposal? He asked. 3 months earlier, I'd submitted a proposal for a comprehensive guide to financial abuse recovery, combining practical advice with personal narratives from women I'd worked with. The book would be the natural extension of my speaking, engagements, and advocacy work, reaching people who couldn't attend conferences or afford private consulting services. They want to meet next week, I said. Apparently, there's significant interest in the topic, but they want to make sure I can reach beyond the purely professional market to speak to general audiences. The book represented another evolution in my understanding of how to use my experience constructively. Initially, I'd focused on helping individual clients recover from specific instances of financial abuse. Then I'd expanded to training professionals who worked with abuse victims. Now I was exploring how to reach the broader population of women who might not even recognize that they were experiencing financial control and manipulation. As the reception wound down, I found myself in conversation with Margaret Santos, a family court judge who had become an advocate for legislative changes that would make financial abuse easier to prosecute and recover from. We'd worked together on several cases where criminal charges had been difficult to pursue because existing laws didn't adequately address the sophisticated financial manipulation that characterized modern economic abuse. The Rivera case set important precedents, Judge Santos told me, but we need systemic changes to prevent women from having to rely on exceptional circumstances like trust funds to protect themselves. She was referring to legislation we'd both been supporting that would strengthen penalties for spousal financial abuse and create streamlined legal mechanisms for asset recovery. The bill had bipartisan support, but faced opposition from groups who argued that existing domestic violence laws were sufficient. The problem, I explained to several lawmakers who had joined our conversation, is that financial abuse often occurs without any physical violence, making it difficult to prosecute under traditional domestic violence statutes. We need legal frameworks that recognize economic control and manipulation as distinct forms of abuse with specific remedies. The legislative work had become an unexpected passion for me. While individual client advocacy remained the core of my business, I'd gradually realized that systemic change was necessary to prevent other women from facing the same vulnerabilities I'd encountered. My grandmother's trust fund had been an extraordinary safety net, but most women didn't have access to such resources when they discovered financial betrayal. Later that evening, in the car driving home from the convention center, Michael and I discussed the day's events and the various projects that were emerging from my advocacy work. The business had grown to employ 23 people across 3 offices, and we were receiving requests for consulting services from law firms and social service agencies across the country. Sometimes I can hardly believe this is my life, I admitted as we pulled into the driveway of our shared home, a craftsman house in Wallingford that we'd purchased together 6 months earlier. 3 years ago, I was a financial analyst married to a man who was systematically stealing from me. Now I'm running a multi-million-dollar firm and speaking to audiences about recovery and empowerment. Michael squeezed my hand. You built all of this, Elena. The trust fund gave you resources, but everything else, the business, the advocacy, the impact you're having, that came from your own strength and vision. As we settled into our living room with tea surrounded by the books and artwork that we'd chosen together, I reflected on how completely my definition of success had changed. During my marriage to Marcus, success had been measured through external validation, his approval, social status, the appearance of prosperity and happiness. Now success meant autonomy, authentic relationships, and the ability to help others navigate challenges I'd overcome myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Morrison. Saw the live stream of your keynote. Incredible as always. 3 more. Women reached out tonight after hearing you speak. I'll connect them with Sarah for initial consultations. 3 more women. 3 more opportunities to intervene before financial abuse progressed to the level of devastation that Rebecca and I had experienced. 3 more chances to provide tools and resources that could change the trajectory of someone's life. The ripple effects of my grandmother's foresight continued expanding in ways she never could have anticipated. Her trust fund hadn't just saved me from Marcus Rivera. It had enabled me to build something that could protect other women from men like him. The money she'd earned cleaning office buildings and living frugally had been transformed into a mechanism for preventing financial predation and supporting recovery for those who had already experienced it. Walked to my home office and pulled out the framed letter my grandmother had left for me, reading her words again. Use this money wisely, not to return to what was, but to create what should be. What should be, I'd come to understand, was a world where financial abuse was recognized, prosecuted, and prevented through education and systemic change, where women had access to resources and support when they discovered betrayal, where recovery was possible not just for those with extraordinary safety nets, but for anyone with the courage to seek help. 3 years after Marcus threw wine in my face at that charity gala, I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by what I had chosen to build from the experience. The woman who had once measured her worth through her husband's approval now helped other women discover their own power. The victim had become an advocate, the survivor had become a leader, and the end of one story had become the beginning of something far more meaningful. Tomorrow would bring new clients, new challenges, new opportunities to transform individual healing into collective change, and I would meet them with the confidence that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I was capable of. Knowledge that no one could ever steal from me again. The notification that appeared on my phone screen at 6:47 a.m. on a crisp October morning would have terrified the woman I used to be. Instead, it brought a smile to my face as I sipped coffee in the sunroom of our Wallingford home, watching Michael tend to the garden we'd planted together. Urgent. Marcus Rivera released early for good behavior. Requesting supervised meeting. To discuss important matters regarding your shared history. Contact through parole officer. 5 years. He'd served 5 years of his 7-year sentence, and now he wanted to talk. The old Elena might have panicked, called Catherine Morris, for emergency security protocols or hidden behind lawyers and restraining orders. But the woman I'd become simply forwarded the message to my legal team and continued planning my day. That afternoon, I was scheduled to sign the final contracts for what would become the Elena Vasquez Institute for Financial Recovery, a nonprofit foundation funded by my grandmother's trust that would provide free legal and financial services to women experiencing economic abuse. The institute represented the culmination of 5 years of advocacy work, the permanent institutionalization of everything I'd learned about helping others rebuild their lives after financial betrayal. My phone buzzed with a call from David Patterson. "Elena, I assume you saw the notification about Marcus." I did. What does he want? According to his parole officer, he claims to have information about additional victims from before his marriage to you. Women he says he wants to make amends to as part of his rehabilitation process. I set down my coffee cup, immediately suspicious. Marcus Rivera didn't do anything without calculating personal advantage. His sudden interest in making amends to previous victims sounded more like a manipulation strategy than genuine remorse. Do we know anything about these supposed victims? That's what concerns me, David admitted. We've identified 2 women from his past who experienced similar patterns of financial abuse, but there may be others. The question is whether his desire to make amends is genuine or whether he's looking for ways to contact you indirectly. The conversation reminded me that recovery from financial abuse wasn't a linear process with a clear endpoint. Even 5 years later, even with all the success and healing and growth I'd experienced, Marcus could still disrupt my peace with a single phone call. The difference was that disruption no longer meant devastation. "I'll consider meeting with him," I said, surprising both David and myself. "But only under specific conditions, supervised setting, limited time, and only if he provides concrete information about other victims that can help us assist them." The decision felt right in a way that my old instincts of avoidance and fear never had. I wasn't the same woman Marcus had stolen from and manipulated. I was someone who had built her life around helping people recover from exactly the kind of damage he specialized in inflicting. Meeting with him wasn't about him. It was about potentially helping others. The meeting took place 2 weeks later in a sterile conference room at the federal building, with his parole officer present, Catherine Morris providing security oversight, and David Patterson handling legal protocols. Marcus looked older than his 58 years, his silver hair now completely gray, his once commanding presence diminished by the institutional pallor of someone who'd spent years in federal prison. But his eyes were the same, calculating, strategic, immediately assessing angles and opportunities. When he saw me enter the room, his expression shifted through surprise, evaluation, and what might have been genuine regret before settling into practiced contrition. "Elena," he said quietly, "you look successful, happy." "I am both of those things," I replied, taking the seat across from him without ceremony. "Your parole officer says you have information about other women you defrauded. Let's discuss that." For the next hour, Marcus provided details about 3 additional women he'd financially abused during relationships spanning back 15 years. The information was specific enough to be verifiable: names, dates, methods of theft, amounts stolen. It painted a picture of a man who had been systematically targeting and destroying women's financial security for over a decade before I'd met him. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked when he'd finished his recitation. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. "Because I've had 5 years to think about what I did to you, to them, to everyone whose lives I damaged for my own benefit. I can't undo any of it, but maybe the information can help you help them. And what do you get out of providing this information?" His smile was rueful. "Nothing. That's what I've learned, Elena. For years, I operated under the assumption that every interaction had to benefit me somehow. It's an exhausting way to live, and it ultimately destroyed everything I touched." I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize during our marriage. But Marcus seemed genuinely different. Not reformed exactly, but worn down by consequences in a way that suggested authentic accountability rather than strategic positioning. "There's something else," he continued. "I owe you an apology that I should have made years ago. What I did to you wasn't just theft. It was a systematic attempt to destroy your sense of self so I could control you more effectively. I convinced myself it was love, but it was really just possession. You deserved better than that, and I'm sorry." The apology was more complete than anything I'd expected to hear from him. It acknowledged not just the financial crimes, but the psychological manipulation that had been equally damaging. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of the man I'd thought I'd married. Intelligent, articulate, capable of insight and remorse. "I accept your apology," I said finally. "And I'll use the information you've provided to help the other women you mentioned. But Marcus, this doesn't change anything between us. We have no relationship beyond this conversation." He nodded without argument. "I know. I just wanted you to know that your success, everything you've built, it gives meaning to what I destroyed. You turned my betrayal into something that helps other people. That's more than I deserved, and I'm grateful for it." As I left the federal building, I felt an unexpected sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. Seeing Marcus diminished and genuinely remorseful hadn't been satisfying in the way I might have expected. Instead, it had been simply complete. The final chapter of a story that had begun with wine thrown in my face at a charity gala and had evolved into something much larger than either of us. The information Marcus provided led to successful civil recovery cases for 2 of the 3 women he'd identified. Both had given up hope of ever recovering what he'd stolen from them, and both became clients of the Elena Vasquez Institute when it officially launched 6 months later. The Institute's opening ceremony took place in the same hotel ballroom where I'd once attended networking events as Mrs. Marcus Rivera, desperately trying to make connections that might advance my subordinated career. Now I stood before an audience of judges, lawmakers, social workers, and financial professionals, announcing the creation of a permanent resource for women experiencing economic abuse. 5 years ago, I told the assembled crowd, I discovered that my husband had stolen my life savings to fund an affair. I was lucky. I had resources and support that many women in similar situations don't have access to. The Elena Vasquez Institute exists to ensure that survival and recovery from financial abuse doesn't depend on luck. In the audience, I could see faces that represented the journey from that devastating discovery to this moment of institutional impact. Rebecca Morrison, now engaged to a kind man who celebrated her strength rather than exploiting her vulnerabilities. Dr. Amanda Sterling, who had not only recovered her stolen assets, but had become a major donor to our cause. Lisa Chen, who had escaped her husband's financial manipulation before it progressed to the level of devastation I'd experienced. Michael sat in the front row, his pride evident in the way he watched me speak. We'd been married for 6 months. Now, a small ceremony focused on joy and partnership rather than the elaborate performance my first wedding had been. Our prenuptial agreement was straightforward and mutual, protecting both our individual assets while acknowledging our shared commitment to building something together. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when I announced the Institute's First major initiative: a partnership with federal law enforcement to train investigators in recognizing and prosecuting sophisticated financial abuse cases. The program would use my experience and that of other survivors to educate law enforcement about the subtle but devastating tactics used by financial predators. Economic abuse thrives in isolation and silence, I explained to the audience. It's prevented through education, community support, and systemic changes that make it easier to recognize, prosecute, and recover from. No woman should have to rely on a secret trust fund to protect herself from the person who promised to love and protect her. The applause that followed felt different from the polite recognition I'd received at corporate events during my marriage to Marcus. This was acknowledgement of authentic accomplishment, work that had grown organically from personal experience into community service, into systemic change. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and discussed next steps for various initiatives, I stepped onto the hotel's outdoor terrace overlooking Elliott Bay. The view was identical to what I'd seen from the penthouse I'd shared with Marcus, but everything else had changed completely. My phone buzzed with congratulations, messages from colleagues across the country, updates from the 3 regional institutes that were being modeled after our Seattle program, and interview requests from journalists writing about the growing recognition of financial abuse as a distinct form of domestic violence. But the message that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Watched the live stream of your speech. Proud of what you've built from something so devastating. Mr. Marcus, messaging from whatever supervised living situation he'd been assigned after his release, acknowledging that I'd transformed his betrayal into something constructive. The man who had once tried to steal my identity had become a witness to my authentic success. I deleted the message without responding. Some conversations were complete without requiring continuation. As the sun set over the Sound, painting the sky in colors that would have made perfect Instagram content during my previous life, I simply stood and watched without documenting the moment for anyone else's consumption. The beauty was mine to experience directly, fully, without translation into performance or proof. Michael joined me on the terrace, slipping his arm around my waist in the comfortable way of partners who knew. They chose each other freely every day. Happy? He asked, though my expression probably made the answer obvious. More than happy, I replied. Complete. The woman who had once measured her worth through her husband's approval, who had sacrificed her dreams to support someone else's ambitions, who had been so systematically manipulated that she doubted her own perceptions, was gone. In her place was someone who had learned to trust her instincts, build authentic relationships, and use her experience to create meaningful change in the world. 6 years after that devastating discovery of empty bank accounts, I stood as the founder of an organization that had helped over 800 women recover from financial abuse, the author of a book that was required reading in social work programs across the country, and a person whose life was defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to build from the experience. The prenup activation code my grandmother had built into her trust hadn't just saved my assets, it had saved my life. Not just from financial ruin, but from the slow death of living as someone else's possession rather than as my own complete person. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women seeking help, new opportunities to expand the reach and impact of everything I'd built. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in a life I'd chosen, with a partner who celebrated my strength, surrounded by work that gave meaning to even the most painful experiences. My grandmother had been right. Woman's true security came not from any man's promises, but from her own strength and wisdom. The trust fund had given me choices, but the choices I'd made had given me freedom, and that freedom, it turned out, was worth more than all the money in the world. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear about it in the comments below. Have you ever experienced financial manipulation in a relationship? Do you know someone who has? Your engagement helps these important stories reach the people who need to hear them most. And if you found value in Elena's journey from victim to survivor to advocate, make sure you're subscribed to this channel with notifications turned on. Tomorrow, I'm sharing another incredible story of transformation that will change how you think about resilience and the power of refusing to let betrayal define your future. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next story. Remember, your past doesn't determine your potential, and your worst moments can become the foundation for your greatest victories.